My name is Renee Graham, and I'm a Globe opinion columnist and associate editor. Welcome to today's Globe Op Talk with Barbara Smith. The problem is white supremacy. Barbara Smith is an author, activist, and independent scholar who's played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national, cultural, and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She was among the first to define an African-American women's literary tradition and to build Black women's studies and Black feminism in the United States. Since the 1960s, Barbara has been politically active in many movements for social justice. She has edited 3 major collections about Black women, including All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies with Gloria T. Hull and Patricia Bell Scott in 1982, and Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology in 1983. She was co-founder, and publisher until 1995 of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, the first American publisher for women of color. A recipient of numerous awards and accolades, Smith was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2005. Welcome, Barbara.
Hello, Renee. I think it's still good morning.
Yes, it is, remarkably. So since the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, systemic racism has become the phrase on everyone's lips, what it means, those it impacts, why it must be dismantled. In her remarkable Globe op-ed, The Problem is White Supremacy, Barbara recast the conversation, arguing that, quote, the reason America's pattern of racial terrorism keeps repeating is because the system of white supremacy that spawns the terrorism remains intact. In short, white supremacy is the cause. Systemic racism is the effect, and you cannot eradicate the latter without first demolishing the former. Since its publication 2 weeks ago, Barbara's column has remained one of the most read in Globe opinion. So Barbara, for listeners who aren't quite sure what we mean when we talk about white supremacy, how do you define it?
Well, white supremacy, I just want to say how pleased I am to be having this conversation with you and with the Globe community and many others today. White supremacy is a system. It is not personal attitudes. It's not necessarily totally focused on prejudice or bigotry or individual perspectives about people based upon race. It is the system that really built this nation. And we see that when we look at the origin story of the United States, because the United States began as a settler country, the genocide of indigenous people, and also then very quickly the enslavement of people of African heritage, brought here involuntarily to work without compensation for centuries, starting in 1619. So that system is what, as I said, really organizes our nation in virtually every aspect of our lives, and yet it is virtually never acknowledged as existing. So how do we get past where we are now if we never talk about what's going on?
You know, in a nation that can barely utter the word racism without cringing, what do you think about America's capacity to talk candidly about white supremacy?
Well, I'm not really that politically naive. As you mentioned in my introduction, I've been politically active since I was a teenager in Cleveland, Ohio. And that was the 1960s. That's the last century, the 1960s. So I'm not really that politically naive. I did not write this because I thought that the scales would suddenly fall away from people's eyes and they would suddenly wake up and say, oh, that's really not right. We shouldn't really be acting that way. Let's do something different. That's not why I wrote it. I was frustrated because of the fact that, of course, this issue of our racism pandemic has been front and center since George Floyd was lynched in late May of this year, just a few weeks ago. We've had a conversation about race unlike any I've ever seen because it has been so widespread and the response has been 50 state wide in places where they're not significant populations of people of color of any background, not just of African heritage, but where, as I said, they're basically are primarily almost entirely white populations. They're coming out in their little towns and their suburbs and wherever they are to say that Black Lives Matter. So as I said, I wrote it not thinking that suddenly there would be this transformation. I wanted to put something out on the table that wasn't being talked about by other people, because people talk about parts of what's going on. A lot of discussion about changing the culture of police, but you can't change the culture of the police if you don't change the culture of the culture.
I want to talk to you about the, you mentioned it a little bit, but the inception of this column that you wrote. What was on your mind before you sat down to start writing it?
Well, like everyone, George Floyd was murdered or killed. I know murdered is a legal term, was killed on May the 25th, Memorial Day. And the nation did not know that had happened until the following day. That was Tuesday. I started writing the op-ed on Friday. So basically 4 days later, within 4 days of having found out what had occurred. And I wrote it because I had to. I just felt I've got to write down what I see as what is going on, because there was already a lot of discussion that had happened and nobody was talking about white supremacy. They might mention white supremacy, but they never explained what it was. And they never said where it came from or how it operated. So that was what was in my mind. I've just got to write this down. And even though I'm a published author of many decades duration, I'm not a writer who writes every day, far from it. And I'm not a writer who finds it easy to write. I don't know. I'd love to ask you, do you think it's easy to write? I don't think it's that easy to write. But it's not easy. It's work. But I just felt motivated to get this on paper. And I did not have a publisher for it when I wrote it. So I was not on assignment. I often write on assignment with a deadline. So I just kept up with doing it day after day until I finished it a couple of weeks later. And then I sent it out.
Language carries weight. And when this nation tries to discuss racism, as you say in your column, the way we describe this problem matters. So can you talk about the intentionality of language here? What gets said, what doesn't get said in these national discussions about racism, and how that shapes policy and action?
Well, I use the term white supremacy. I've always used the term white supremacy to talk about the system under which we live. We live under other systems as well. We live under racial capitalism. We live under heteropatriarchy, which I think is a really good term for talking about all of the kinds of bigotry and oppression that stems from one's gender, one's sexuality, or one's gender expression. So that's heteropatriarchy. There's sexism. That's another way to talk about the things that happen because people are women. But be that as it may, I've always used the term white supremacy, and I've always been frustrated by the fact that that's what people generally don't talk about. They talk about race relations, they talk about prejudice, they talk about bigotry, they talk about racism, but they don't necessarily talk about white supremacy, because when you confront white supremacy and look that system, kind of take it on head on, then you have to make some different decisions, or you have to have at least some different thought processes. Because if it's only race relations, then maybe a anti-bias training might address it. If it's only prejudice, then maybe you can change your heart and your mind and things will get better. If it's white supremacy, you have to think about it a totally different way.
And we'll talk about that different way you have to then think about it.
Well, as you know, and people who have read the op-ed, I actually proposed some solutions that I would love to see occur, but solutions that would have the scope of a Marshall Plan or of the space race to address something that is that huge and that pervasive. A younger friend of mine, after he read the op-ed, he said that he wanted to sign up for the Anti-White Supremacy Peace Corps. And I just loved it. Needless to say, I laughed my head off when I read that. And I wrote back to him, I said, that's great. I would like to be the founding director of the Anti-White Supremacy Peace Corps, because there are actually ways that we as a nation and as a society could indeed address these issues, but there would first have to be the will to do that. And my profession, as I think you probably alluded to, my profession is teaching African American studies, specifically Black literature, African American literature, women's studies, and Black women's literature. I've been doing that since 1971. So that's a long time to be looking at the history, the culture, the realities of Black life in the United States. That's a long time to be doing that. And the reason I mentioned that is because a person like me, and there are a lot of people like me, who are experts in related fields, not just African American studies, but there are many people like me who do have solutions, but these are solutions that cannot be implemented because there is no national political will to do so.
It's interesting because, you know, a lot of states are facing primaries in a few weeks. We also have the general election in November. If you go to every candidate's website right now, everyone has a section on systemic racism and what they will do, why they're the person who will help dismantle systemic racism. And I've gone through a lot of these websites, and not once have I seen the term white supremacy. So,
well,
right. So it feels like for a lot of people, they're not making that connection between systemic racism and white supremacy. It's almost as if white supremacy is a bridge too far in the way that people can turn off if you talk about white privilege. What is the challenge in getting people to make that very obvious connection that the scaffolding, if you will, of systemic racism is white supremacy?
Well, I think the reason that people don't like talking about white supremacy is because of the fact that they see it as pejorative about white people. They see it as negative about white people and whiteness. It sounds accusatory. White supremacy. There must be some white people somewhere who think they're superior to some other kinds of people who are not white. That's what they think white supremacy means. And I can understand why they might be reluctant. They also, I think, are reluctant because they don't actually want to get to it root and branch, because to get to it root and branch would take some profound changes, not necessarily negative changes, because people always think that the more justice you have, the less justice some other people get or have. That's not true. Justice is not like in a measuring cup or in a 5-pound bag of flour. There's an infinite amount of justice to be had, an infinite amount. But we have to join together to achieve that and to garner that infinite amount of justice that exists. So in the deficit model, you know, the way that people think about rights and justice, they think, well, if those people have more justice and they get treated more fairly, then I'll be treated less fairly. That's the American way. That is the American way. Another metaphor for that is the pie. You know, that there's a pie that is a certain size, and that if you divide it up fairly or even unfairly, some people will get a crumb and other people will take like 85% of the pie home with them. So when you have that kind of mentality, people don't really want to grapple with what's underneath. And one thing I really want to point out about my op-ed, and this is true not just of the op-ed, but of how I have negotiated the racial quagmire of being Black and living in the United States for these 73 years. The op-ed, there's not a single negative thing in that op-ed about white people. I say not one single word that is accusatory, that is critical, that attacks. The closest thing I get to a negative is when I say white supremacy is not the delusional notion that you're superior to someone based upon your race. That's as close as I get. And all those other 1,199 words, 1,100, 199, it's almost 1,200 words. But none of those other words say anything about white people and what's wrong with them, because it's not about that. I've been saying for years, and I've done many anti-racism presentations. They're usually in the form of lectures, often on college and university campuses. I've taught countless classes in African American literature and African American studies. I've done workshops, all kinds of things. And I always say, it's not about your individualized attitudes per se. It's about the system. What are we going to do to take apart this system? And I think a Marshall Plan or a space race level program initiative to address white supremacy, that could happen and that could work if there was a political will. It's solvable. It is solvable.
What would that Marshall Plan look like to you?
Well, some of the words that did not go in, there's some that I actually did leave out because, for obvious reasons, space, and just couldn't make them fit in a logical way. I talked about some of the things that could happen. Since I'm an educator, like a lot of my examples were about education, about changing textbooks, for example, having as a part of every curriculum the kind of material that the Teaching Tolerance project of the Southern Poverty Law Center has been providing for probably at least 20 years. I can't remember exactly when it started. I think it was the early 90s when Teaching Tolerance began. And that's specifically aimed at pre-K through 12 educators and schools. So to have an agreed upon kind of way of introducing the reality of racial diversity in this nation, and also talking about the history and the culture in positive and useful ways, wouldn't that be terrific? I think that every system that we have in the nation could be examined in that light. A lot of discussion nowadays about racial health disparities that we see with the COVID-19 pandemic, and how disproportionately Black, brown, and indigenous people are affected by the pandemic, and that's because of systemic health disparities based upon race, which are also tied to class and economic status. So what would it look like then to take apart and look at our, not take apart as in get rid of, but what would it look like to look at our healthcare system and try to figure out, what do we do to make this different? What do we do to make it different so that Black women who are pregnant don't die at 2.5 times the rate of white women who are pregnant? Black babies also die at twice the rate. Like, what if we decided that we wanted to alter that? We could.
4 years ago, we had a major party candidate run on a promise to restore white supremacy, essentially. Here we are again with that man running for re-election, speaking even more directly to his base about our heritage, which of course means preserving white supremacy. What has been and continues to be the cost for not speaking frankly about this nation's foundational white supremacy?
I would say the most obvious cost, I'll just say some words, some names: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice. I can go on and on. Philando Castile, Eric Garner. I mean, the names are legion. The names are legion. There is a memorial museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that is a museum that documents the history of lynching, extrajudicial murders in the United States. Numbers vary, but usually the figure of about 4,000 people, and that is men, women, and children.
That was only
Men,
updated, I believe. They
say
were
it
saying
again.
that was only recently updated. For a long time, they were thinking it was more around 2,000, and now
Yeah,
they are at
yeah,
least 4,000 people.
yeah, but it's Brian Stevens, right? I mean, his incredible work. That's why there is a memorial, and why there is so much incredible research. You can actually go to their website and you can pick a county. You can pick any county and you can see exactly how many lynchings were recorded in a particular county. I did that a couple of years ago. My people come from a little town in Georgia called Dublin. So I went to the county, which is Lawrence County, and I saw exactly how many people had been lynched in the county where my people came from. You can do that. But you asked, like, what's the most damaging and detrimental aspect? Obviously, the extrajudicial killings of Black people would be the answer. But then there's everything else. People are dying from poverty every day. People are in our criminal injustice system, and that's what I call it, a criminal injustice system. We have the new Jim Crow, thanks to Elizabeth Alexander. We have a concept, more than a concept, for understanding that. There are people in prison doing hard time and long time where other people of a different race got, probation and time served or whatever. We have so many situations to deal with. You look at the education system, the achievement gap. You look at the school to prison pipeline. There are so many devastating consequences of living in an unjust society. But the question is, again, and I've said it over and over, I didn't know I'd be repeating myself this much, it's like, do we have the political will to alter that? Is it okay with us that 5-year-olds who act up in a elementary school classroom get handcuffed? Is that okay with us? Or would we like to live in a different kind of place?
I want to switch gears here a little bit. You were born in 1946 and raised in Cleveland.
Yes.
How did growing up, essentially, you grew up during the Jim Crow era, an American side. How did that shape you politically, and how do those beginnings still inform your activism today?
Well, I just want to say that my dear sister Beverly Smith is here with us on this Zoom, and we're twins, so I can't talk about my growing up years without talking about our growing up years. Whenever anyone asks me about my growing up years, I switch to the first person plural, we, because I'm a twin, I have to think about like saying I so that people are not confused. But anyway, we were very fortunate, my sister and I. We had a wonderful family. As I mentioned, they had been a part of the Great Migration from Georgia. They started coming to Cleveland after World War I. And they didn't really talk that much about race per se. But I feel like we got it through our pores. It was like through osmosis. They were definitely race women. The people in my family were race women. They were very active in our church, which was Antioch Baptist Church, which was the leading Black church. It was a big, I think it was the largest. It was the most prominent Black church in Cleveland. And to me, the reason it was the most prominent is that our minister was a leader in Cleveland civic life, even when most Black people could not be elected to anything. He was a person who got consulted with if there was a Negro problem. And every single Sunday, and remember, those Sundays were during the Civil Rights era. So with the Montgomery bus boycott, with Emmett Till, with the Little Rock 9 and the desegregation of Little Rock High School, end of the 60s, the March on Washington, every single thing that happened was talked about on Sunday from the pulpit of our church. And it was also talked about at home because our family was into the word, books, of course, but Cleveland at that time, which is one of the 10 largest cities in the nation. Cleveland is the butt of many jokes these days and has been, although a certain person whose initials are LB have got, LJ, LeBron James, sorry, have brought that kind of back. But the thing is that people don't understand the Cleveland that I grew up in. It was a metropolis, and we had 3 daily newspapers. Our family subscribed to 2 of those newspapers, and then the weekly Black newspaper, and then sometimes the Pittsburgh Courier. So we were getting the information. Ebony and Jet, dare I mention, how could I leave out Ebony and Jet? So we grew up in a very Black conscious family and community. And because all these events were happening, the older my sister and I got, the more we understood and the more we wanted to be a part of all that. And that's when she and I became politically active as teenagers. The issues that were being organized around by the civil rights movement in Cleveland, the major issue was school desegregation. And they brought students into that. And I've been doing it ever since.
In the 70s, you were a founding member of the Kambahee River Collective. It was started here in Boston, which actually surprised me today, by a group of Black feminists and lesbians with long histories of social and political activism. What was the impetus for that collective?
We had been involved with the National Black Feminist Organization, and a lot of people probably don't know about that. It was, the initials were NBFO, and it was similar in some ways to NOW, the National Organization for Women. It was an organization that had chapters in various cities. My sister Beverly and I attended the first Eastern Regional Conference of the National Black Feminist Organization in 1973. And we were charged with, those of us who attended that very, very dynamic conference that had people like June Jordan and Alice Walker and Faith Ringgold and Shirley Chisholm and Eleanor Holmes Norton. Those were the people at this conference. We were charged with going back, some of the people, I didn't mention all of the hundreds of people who came, but we were charged with going back to our respective communities and starting chapters of the National Black Feminist Organization. We did that in Boston, and then not long, maybe a year or so after that, we decided we wanted to be an independent group. And so that's when we started the Kambahee River Collective. We renamed ourselves the Kambahee River Collective. But in those days, Black women were not seen as being very important politically or important at all in any way. It wasn't that there was not a history in our African American community of Black women being very, very involved in struggle. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there was no real understanding or acknowledgement, except on rare occasions, that Black women had a particular set of concerns and issues that they also needed to organize around. For example, violence against women. So we wanted to do that, and we just stepped out, not necessarily with ground underneath us. We just stepped out on that ledge and said, let's try to do this.
In 1977, the collective issued this historic statement, and it's remarkable in and of itself. What also makes it stand out is the fact that it remains absolutely relevant 43 years later. Not necessarily because the group was prescient, but because so little has really changed. And I just want to read something very quickly from it. Above all else, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, but because of our need as human persons for autonomy. This may seem so obvious as to sound simplistic, but it is apparent that no other ostensibly progressive movement has ever considered our specific oppression a priority or worked seriously for the ending of that oppression. I read that and I thought very much about what's happening in the movement today and the ways that we know historically Black women have been marginalized in the civil rights movement, the way they were erased from their work towards the 1963 March on Washington. This almost feels like a template for young activists today what are your concerns about these same dynamics playing out in the movement today that you as Black women feminists were facing 40 years ago?
That's a really interesting question. I just want to mention that my sister Beverly and Demita Frazier, we were the three co-authors of the Kambahee River Collective Statement. Although the group was not huge, but although there were other people in the group, it was the three of us who worked on that statement and drafted that statement and then wrote that statement. Around what's going on today, it's interesting because the people who are very visible as founders, co-founders of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, they readily acknowledge that they have drawn inspiration from specifically the Kambahee River Collective and the Kambahee River Collective Statement. They acknowledge that. And like Charlene Carruthers, for example, who was a co-founder of BYP 100, a Chicago-based but national Black Lives Matter organization. BYP stands for Black Youth Project 100. And as I said, she was a co-founder and their first executive director. She has a book titled Unapologetic, and she talks about doing work from a queer Black feminist lens. So what's interesting is that there is that acknowledgement in a movement that is not primarily focused on sexuality and gender issues. So BLM and the Movement for Black Lives is focused upon criminal justice, mass incarceration, abolition, the police, defunding the police, all those kinds of issues that are very much in people's consciousness right now during this period. But the fact that they draw from Black feminism and acknowledge that, they also draw from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and there are other places that they're drawing from the past. Now, as far as is the level of sexism or being pushed to the side the same as it was back then, I really can't speak to that. I don't know. My kind of information stream is limited by what I watch and what I read, and I see a lot of Black women in very significant positions being able to shape our conversations and provide leadership for our political activism and action. So I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but sexism isn't gone and male chauvinism isn't over. So that can lead right up. I mean, I don't know if this is an appropriate anecdote or not, but there was a person who was at one point the front runner for the president getting the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. His name was Bernie Sanders, and Senator Bernie Sanders, and I supported him in 2016, and I was a national surrogate for the campaign this time in 2020. And there was a person who's a prominent commentator, and one Friday, I believe it was a Friday evening, he decided to put out a tweet that talked about how those of us who were supporting supporting Bernie Sanders was from the island of, and I won't be able to think of the word.
It was the island of misfit Black girls.
Oh yes, misfit. Yeah, maybe it's because it's so painful. Yes, but we were from the island of misfit Black girls. Boy, did we go to town with that. We had fun with that all weekend long, and longer than that, we were tweeting. I love Twitter. I'm on Twitter. We were tweeting at each other, and I'm sure other the social media platforms too, sending love from the island of misfit Black girls. People saying, can they get a boat, a cruise to get there? They wanted to get, they wanted to get there as soon as possible. It was like, but that's what he thought, that we were on the island of misfit Black girls because of the presidential candidate who we were supporting. So obviously these attitudes are not gone.
I do want to make sure I leave time for questions. So I want to finish up with one last question. At the end of the statement, it reads, as Black feminists and lesbians, we know that we have a definite revolutionary task to perform, and we are ready for the lifetime of work and struggle before us. How can today's warriors against patriarchy, against systemic racism, and against especially white supremacy prepare for the lifetime of work and struggle before them?
I am so glad that you asked me that, Renee, because I have certain hobby horses, and now I get to share a couple of my hobby horses about what people need to do to be politically ready, to be effective, to make profound and lasting change. The first thing I would advise is that you have got to know your history, and you have got, the only way you can find out about that history in any substantive way is to read it. I am so sorry. You do have to read about it. Yes, the documentaries are good. You can watch a lot of documentaries, but if you really want to refine and deepen your political understandings of who you are, where you are right now, you have to read deeply about what were the people saying and what were the people doing 100 years ago or even longer about the very same problems. What were the people doing in other countries and other nations around the globe about similar problems, if not the same problems? You got to read. You have got to read, and you have got to study, not just read quickly in articles or whatever. You got to read deeply and be in study groups and really like just dig into what is Du Bois saying when he said, what is Angela Davis saying when he said, what is James Baldwin saying when he wrote? You got to do it. You absolutely have got to do that. And another thing is that you have to work collectively. You've got to work collectively. There's no individual on the face of the earth who has ever come up with solutions for social problems. I think scientists in labs, they may indeed come up with something that turns into a solution for a physical problem, a medical problem. Even they would say, oh no, we always work collaboratively. It was because of what so-and-so did. They'll list you 20 people whose work they looked at that gave them their bright idea. But if you're talking about social problems, if you're talking about economic problems, you cannot do it by yourself. One other thing, and that is the need to work in coalition. Because just like no individual can come up with the solution for a social problem, nor can any one group that is oppressed. All the oppressions are connected. We say that in the Kambahee River Collective Statement, that our politics are based upon the fact that the systems of oppression are interlocking. So if you think that poverty and economic exploitation that people who are white experience, if you think that's not your problem, you really need to think again. Doesn't mean you had to love everybody, like everybody, hang out with everybody. You don't have to. You have to do something, which is another word, one of my hobby horse words. You have to be in solidarity with people. And when you're in solidarity with people, you figure out how to work through and work together to get to that big goal. And that goal is justice.
I think we're going to turn now to op-ed editor Marjorie Pritchard, who's going to be moderating the questions. Hi, Marge.
Hi, Renee, and hi, Barbara.
Hello.
You spoke about curriculum and knowing your history, and one of our readers would like to know, what does a successful elementary and secondary school curriculum look like for preventing white supremacy in children?
Well, thank you, Marjorie. I've already talked about the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance Initiative. It is so incredibly useful for classroom teachers at those elementary, primary, and secondary grade levels that the reader is interested in. If you go to their site, you will find just a plethora of resources. They also publish a print magazine that comes out twice a year that is titled Teaching Tolerance, and it is free to all classroom teachers. All you have to do is contact them, let them know your school information, and you will become a subscriber for free to Teaching Tolerance. And the level of innovative ideas that they offer is just amazing. Every one of those issues has a book list in it, and they really drill down into the whole situation of how do we teach our kids to do something different than what perhaps they have what people have done in years past, because they address all the kinds of issues that people are facing around inequality and injustice, including immigrant issues of immigrants, LGBTQIA plus issues in the classroom, poverty, living with disabilities, both physical and mental and emotional. They address everything. So that's an incredibly rich resource. And I suggested it recently in a meeting, and people objected to the name Teaching Tolerance. I said, I think when Teaching Tolerance first started, I wrote to the Southern Poverty Law Center and said that name is like a little problematic, because tolerance is, we want more than tolerance, but that's what they called it. Don't get hung up on the name. Go and find the information. One other resource is the Zen Education Project, which is named after Howard Zen, longtime Boston resident, and of course the author of A People's History of the United States.
One of our other readers would like to know, what's the appropriate role of corporate America in dismantling white supremacy?
That is a really interesting question. What I would first say is, when you look at what corporations do and what the purpose of corporations is, corporations are not in the business of expanding justice. That is not what corporations do. Corporations have another purpose, which you can ascertain for yourself. But having said that, so you might want to look at institutions in the society that actually have some potential for justice. For example, religious and spiritual institutions. That's more closely aligned with the kinds of issues that we're talking about today. But corporations can definitely desegregate their workforces, particularly their high-level executive workforce, the C-suites as they call them. They can also desegregate their boards of directors. And when we get that Marshall Plan underway, they can absolutely help to fund those initiatives.
And our last question before I send it back to Renee is, if anti-bias training doesn't work, how do we dismantle white supremacy? Do you worry that the only recourse to appeal to white people is to tear down a system that benefits them?
I would not say that anti-bias training does not work, but let's talk about what it works to accomplish. Anti-bias training focuses upon either institutional culture or individual attitudes that are discriminatory. So anti-bias training can absolutely address those things. Changing the culture of a workplace or another kind of institution, and also helping people to question and to think differently about people who are different from themselves. So it's not that anti-bias training doesn't work. It's just that it's not ideally suited or suited at all to changing a system of power, which is what white supremacy is. It would take a much larger landscape to be able to do that. Of course, I would like to see it be national, but if it's not national, maybe a city or a state could decide that they wanted to address white supremacy in some really comprehensive ways. And I actually think that Boston and Massachusetts would be the ideal state and the ideal city. Just saying, having lived there for 9 years, and because of like the political culture of Massachusetts, I think it'd be a great place if we couldn't get it on the national level, let's have Massachusetts be the kind of laboratory for that. I would say New York State, but New York is too crazy, so I'm not going to go there.
I think we should start here. I think that's a great idea.
I
Well,
think
thank you very much. And back to you, Renee.
I'm not sure how much time we have left, Barbara, but I did want to ask you one last question. In the Kambahee River Collective Statement, you coined the term identity politics. And what you wrote was, focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression. Can you talk about what that term meant when you wrote it in '77, and what you think about how it's been warped in modern politics and how activists can take that phrase back?
I'm so glad that you asked that, Renee, because there has been so much distortion of what we meant. And usually, of course, no one ever asks what we meant because they don't know that we exist, literally. The term identity politics has come into the kind of spoken language and written language without ever there being it being sourced to the Kambahee River Collective. I don't think that when the right wing talks about identity politics, I don't think it's because they read the Kambahee River Collective Statement. I think that you can put those two concepts together. I think that maybe it started in colleges and universities on campuses where work was being taught, and maybe the concept of identity politics, kind of took off from there, and as I said, has become very distorted. What we meant simply was this, that as Black women, we wanted to formulate our own appropriate and relevant political agendas as Black women. That we did not want to be generic women without race, and therefore have our feminist politics defined by white women's understandings of what that would look like, nor did we want to be generic Black people without gender or sex or sexuality, and have Black politics be defined as what Black males decided and chose to focus upon. We wanted politics and a political agenda that actually connected to our lived experience, which was most shaped by our multiple identities, hence identity politics. And people have taken it and run with it, run with it, and just done terrible things. There's a book by Mark Lilla about identity politics. David Brooks has written about identity politics. People in the current presidential administration slam identity politics. I mean, it's just bad mouth all over the place. And as I have recently said in another piece, I'm not sure that they would have liked our original meaning either. Those who are hostile to the concept of identity politics, but they might not have liked the original intention either. But we definitely never meant that if you did not have the exact same identity that we did, that you were worth nothing, that you were worthless, and that we did not care whatever happened to you, ever. That's not what we were saying. We were not saying that the only people who mattered were people who were just like us. We were simply trying to say that we need to have political theory and solutions that fit the problem and fit the situation. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, more than a decade later, developed the concept of intersectionality. And she was doing the same thing. She was saying that you can't look at these legal cases of discrimination, and act like a Black woman who experiences discrimination in a workplace where Black women are not hired or promoted, and to say, well, we hire women, oh, they're all white, and we hire Black people, oh, well, they're mostly entirely men. You can't say that those classes of employees, that their situations address the discrimination that people who are simultaneously Black and female experience. That's what Kimberly Crenshaw was saying. Same concept, that you have to look at the whole picture.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Barbara Smith, so very, very much. This has been my honor to spend this time with you. I was trying to cram 35 years of questions into about 45 minutes. So thank you for your patience, and everyone who's been tuned in. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation of Globe Op Talks. Please feel free to tune into more of these, and thank you for your time. And thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you to the Boston Globe.